Welcome to the Manga Bay Newscast. It's March 17th, 2020, and I'm your host, Mike Gurecki, bringing you the news and inspiration from nature's front line. Today we discuss marine mammals in the Arctic with Dr. Howard Rosenbaum, the director of the Wildlife Conservation Society's Ocean Giants program. Rosenbaum co-authored a recent study that used bioacoustics to better understand how seasonal variation in sea surface temperatures and sea ice affect populations of 5 species of endemic Arctic marine mammals: bearded seals, beluga whales, bowhead whales, ribbon seals, and walrus. On today's episode, Dr. Rosenbaum joins us to play some of the recordings of marine mammals used in the study and to discuss how the results of the study will help scientists track the impacts of climate change on Arctic ecosystems.
These are some of the most amazing species in the world, right? These are massive numbers of animals congregating in the Bering Strait to use this area. And by, shedding some light on that through the Arctic soundscape that we've helped portray and that your listeners will get to hear a little bit of, you'll begin to put those signature calls to what everyone identifies, and knows via seeing them on TV or on the internet or in an aquarium. Walrus, seals, beluga whales. So it will place some of what, these people see and never get to experience in the wild in some broader context. It will make it more real for people that may never even get a chance to experience these iconic Arctic marine mammals.
But first, here's the top news. The World Health Organization has categorized the novel coronavirus disease, COVID-19, as a pandemic in light of its spread around the world. And conservationists are attempting to set the record straight on the disease's wildlife links. Ever since the first cases of COVID-19 emerged in the Chinese city of Wuhan last December, there's been much speculation and misinformation about the origins of the virus. While scientists suspect it may have come from a market in Wuhan when a diseased animal was consumed or butchered, the issue is far from settled. The Wildlife Conservation Society and Global Wildlife Conservation have partnered on a new informational campaign that they hope will give the public a better understanding of the origin of the coronavirus and what can be done to stop the future spread of disease from animals to humans. Chris Walzer, the executive director of health at WCS, told Manga Bay that it's most likely that the evolutionary or ancestral host was a bat, but that scientists don't yet know how the virus got into humans and which possible intermediary host it passed through. Given the clear risks both to biodiversity and human health, however, scientists at WCS and Global Wildlife Conservation are calling for a permanent ban on wildlife trafficking and live animal markets. Tree cover loss hit record highs across the globe between 2016 and 2018, with an area roughly the size of a soccer field, or football pitch if you prefer, lost each second. In 2018 alone, the area of global tree cover loss was larger than the UK. Using high-resolution Google Earth imagery, researchers measured global forest loss from 2001 to 2015 and categorized its causes, then published the results in 2018. Those numbers were recently updated by the World Resources Institute and the Sustainability Consortium to include data from 2016 to 2018. The new data reveals that global tree cover loss reached an all-time high in 2016 and 2017, with the drivers of loss relatively unchanged from previous years. Worldwide, the primary culprit of tree cover loss continues to be conversion of land to agriculture. And lastly, Afghanistan recently established its 5th national park, the massive Bamyan Plateau Protected Area. The site is home to the Persian leopard and ibex, and serves as a key breeding ground for the endemic Afghan snowfinch. Local inhabitants were crucial to developing the park and are set to have a voice in its management. In addition to conserving the landscape and its plants and wildlife, the protected area is expected to boost tourism and local livelihoods, and serve as a natural respite for a country wary of war. You can read more about all of today's top news items at mangabay.com, and if you'd like to request email alerts when we publish news stories on the topics you care about most, visit alerts.mangabay.com and sign up. Declining Arctic sea ice cover is impacting endemic marine mammals even while it's increasing the presence of disruptive human activities. Dr. Howard Rosenbaum was part of a team of researchers from the Wildlife Conservation Society, Columbia University, Southall Environmental Associates, and the University of Washington that conducted a 4-year bioacoustic study of marine mammals in the northern Bering Sea to help scientists track the impacts of global climate change on Arctic ecosystems. The researchers say theirs is the first study to conduct year-round acoustic monitoring of marine mammals off St. Lawrence Island in the Bering Sea. The research team was supported by local indigenous hunters and fishermen in deploying 3 acoustic recording devices that captured more than 33,000 individual vocalizations from whales, walruses, and seals over the course of the study. Here's Dr. Rosenbaum on the impetus for the study.
As you can imagine, the Arctic is experiencing rapid changes right now. And in areas of the Arctic, we have some really good information about marine mammals. But in one particular area, in the Bering Strait, that relatively narrow passageway that serves as the gateway to the Pacific Arctic, we only had information on a very limited basis for the iconic whales, ice seals, walrus that are in that region seasonally. In fact, amazing concentrations. We're talking about 17,000 bowhead whales. Upwards of 100,000 walrus. Hundreds of thousands of ice seals, beluga whales. And despite all of the efforts to the north and south of the Bering Strait, and some really great studies by some of our colleagues in the Bering Strait, we didn't have that big picture throughout large portions of the area around St. Lawrence Island and in the Bering Strait, where these marine mammals use this habitat as part of their seasonal migrations. And so we set out to change that using acoustic monitoring and a passive acoustic monitoring technology so that we could get a better handle on marine mammals in this area through time and through different locations, so that we could actually establish, what do we know about this area, the marine mammals that inhabit them, and then that serves in essence as a benchmark with these potential changes through time that we're witnessing right now, right in front of our eyes in the Arctic.
As Rosenbaum mentioned, the point of the study was essentially to gather baseline data for marine mammals in the region, which can be used to monitor the animals and their behavior on an ongoing basis.
That was one core goal and one key goal that we had. I mean, first of all, is really just establish a baseline. What's happening in this area, both within a particular year and across several years. So we could establish that baseline. That, in essence, sets that framework, right, about what we know about the Bering Strait region and how important it is for marine mammals in the here and now. Particularly as already, we're already starting to see with sea ice melt and the Arctic opening up, in essence, even increasing anthropogenic pressure. So right in the here and now, that sets that framework for understanding how bowhead whales, beluga, walrus, ice seals use that region and how important it is for them. But it also is, as you correctly point out, it does set that benchmark. So as those changes occur, we can now know, at this point in time, for this time period, that this was, the particular, detections and habitat use by these marine mammals in this area. And then, as we witness and experience changes in the Arctic, both from, climatic as well as anthropogenic pressures, we can see how that does in turn have an effect to the detection rates and patterns of habitat use for these marine mammals.
Many Arctic marine mammal species are important for local indigenous peoples. That's one of the reasons why Rosenbaum and the research team worked with members of local indigenous groups on the study.
This goes hand in hand with the work that we do in the Arctic and that we do around the world. Our local community partners, both in the Arctic, on St. Lawrence Island and elsewhere in the world, are so key to our work. They, in this case, they bring traditional ecological knowledge and expertise, both of the species themselves. They have tremendous amounts of experience and knowledge that's so valuable, both in terms of our understanding of potentially where to target particular areas that are of importance for marine mammals, but also of importance to the local communities, but also could be impacted by climate change or via anthropogenic pressures. So that local knowledge and experience and expertise is invaluable in work like this. We can't do it alone.
The team ultimately captured thousands of hours of recordings, in which thousands of calls by the 5 target species of marine mammals were detected. Here's one of the team's recordings that features numerous species.
I mean, this is where it gets really cool and interesting. So, from all the deployments that we did over the time period, both in the Bering Strait, around St. Lawrence Island at two locations, the villages of Gambell and Savunga, we were able to collect literally hundreds of thousands of minutes of recordings, tens of thousands of total recordings that resulted in, nearly 33,000 detections of these, amazing, iconic marine mammal species from the Arctic. And, what was really important here is that there has been some really, phenomenal work done by our colleagues, in the region, tracking animals, some detailed studies, but those are typically for handfuls of individuals. We learn a lot from those, but this was, a study that gave us that year-round picture. These recorders, sat under the ice, for the entire year. And, we're working every day of the year to detect marine mammals. And so what we ended up with were, nearly 8,000 bowhead whale detections throughout that region, thousands, more than 2,600 beluga whale detections, walrus, bearded seals, ribbon seals, totaling up 33,000 detections. And then that gave us, a better idea of seasonality. When these animals were undertaking their migration, how that was associated with ice, different periods when they would be present and then when they might not be present. And all of that's important, again, to set that initial framework and benchmark of our understanding of, how marine mammals use this particular, narrow body of water that leads into the Pacific Gateway to the Arctic, and where you will have large concentrations of animals there during their migration. I mean, these are some of the most amazing animal migrations on the planet, but they're occurring in such a remote place that most people don't even know about them. And so, in essence, this provides that understanding of how marine mammals, bowhead whales, belugas, walrus, bearded seal, ribbon seals, use this environment. And in particular, we can then, it sets that framework, but then also understanding right here and now how they use that. And particularly as anthropogenic pressures increase in this region, particularly as potential shipping opens up through the Arctic, these are, marine mammals that are protected under U.S. law, under, in some cases, under state laws. And so understanding how and when and where these animals are being detected in the Bering Strait is important to minimize any impacts to them, both now and hopefully in the future.
We've got beluga and bowhead whale calls, as well as walrus and bearded seal calls to listen to today. But first, we're going to listen to some examples of ship noise in the oceans. Here, for instance, is the sound of a large commercial ship.
I think writ large, one of the things that's actually happening around the world is that there's a better understanding today that ocean noise is pervasive and has a significant impact to marine life in our oceans. That's becoming more adopted globally and understood globally. That the sounds that are produced in the ocean from human-made sources, whether they're from shipping or seismic surveys or pile driving or whatever it is, has an impact to essential life functions of marine mammals. In essence, their communications, which can in turn have an impact to essential life functions. And there are very few places in the world that where we have both, important habitats for marine mammals and areas that are relatively quieter than other parts of the ocean. The Arctic, amazingly, because of the conditions, because of the ice, because of the remoteness, it happens to be one of those places. And, a partner study being led by Brandon Southall, our colleague who worked with us on this, and not to get ahead of that study, is showing that, how special, places like the Arctic, like the Bering Strait, are right now because of the relatively low levels of anthropogenic sounds that occurred during the course of our study. We know that's already changing, as the Arctic opens up, as sea ice melts. But in essence, we know that for that reason, I mean, this is really special. And so some of those sounds that you would hear from ships, from seismic air guns, are characteristic of the sounds that can mask these communications between animals. And some of those are used in foraging, some of them are used in breeding, some of them are mother-calf contact calls, mother-pup contact calls. I mean, these are all important to the survivorship of these animals. And in some cases, they can even have physiological effects to their hearing. And we know from some very nice work done by some of our colleagues in the Arctic that have shown that, for example, in the presence of some of these noise sources, bowhead whales, for example, will try to call louder and louder and louder to try to get above some of those sounds. But at some point, they just stop. They just give up. They can't. Their calls are being masked, to a degree which they can't. They're either not effective, and the animals just stop calling. So we know it has an impact. That's a term called masking. So that's the sort of context for some of the work and the impact that anthropogenic noise can have.
How much ship traffic is there actually in the Arctic right now?
That's a good question. Part of the study, and the next phase of the work that we're actually embarking on is to actually get a better handle on that. In the forthcoming paper, it's not part of this paper that we recently published and that we're talking about today, we give a couple of examples of ships that were detected. Overall, at the time of that study, it was relatively low, the ship traffic that we detected in relation to the recorders, and what we could detect, was relatively low over the course of the study. And since that time, when we had the recorders out there, we already know, from tourism, from cruise ships, from other ships, that we know that's increasing. And from even some precursory work that we did, we know that through parts of the Bering Strait, there was already, a decent amount of ship traffic that was going for either mining operations, sometimes for oil and gas surveys, et cetera. So it's there. It just depends on how and how it was detected in relation to some of the work that we were doing. And as you can imagine, it's only projected to increase with time, as certainly as sea ice recedes and melts and the Arctic opens up.
Okay, so Rosenbaum specifically mentioned an air gun, so let's check out the sound of one of those. And here's a merchant vessel. So those recordings hopefully make it pretty obvious why it's possible for these ship sounds to mask the calls of marine mammals like beluga whales, which we'll listen to next.
What was really interesting with some of the work, writ large with some of the beluga whales was that, we had a couple of peak periods where they were detected largely, in two peak periods, and I'm broadly summarizing in relation to the onset of ice, in essence, in November through January, and then again in March through May. That was on and around St. Lawrence Island, and the number of detections that we had in and around the village of Gamble was more so than we had in and around Savunga.
Okay, here's a beluga whale call. Next, we'll hear bowhead whales.
Bowheads, amazing. Clearly, some of the detections that we had. I mean, the total number of bowhead detections that we had was more than 8,000. Remarkable. Other than the ice seals, the largest numbers of detections that we had for any particular species came from bowhead whales. They again, largely present and detected, in the region from the beginning, in essence of, starting, the onset, beginning sometime in November, certainly large numbers of bowhead calls detected through January, and pretty much detected, some periods where we didn't detect them, but all the way again through April and May. And so really amazing, periods where we detected bowhead whales. And again, when we had them, when we were looking at the different monitoring stations, when we looked at these across years, it was pretty consistent. So, we had, so if you looked at it, like, for example, off of the village of Gamble, detections occurring regularly, from, in essence, largely starting in November, even sometimes in October, you're going straight through to April. And again, what I gave you before was the overall picture, so that summarized some areas where we didn't detect them. But, for example, in Gamble, their seasonal presence off of St. Lawrence Island, largely from December to April, and that occurring both in 2015 and again in 2016. Really, consistently they're present there, seasonally, on their migration, associated with the presence, as the ice moves in, they move into these areas. But then also, what was really amazing, also that was tremendously consistent with the traditional ecological knowledge from, our partners and colleagues, living on St. Lawrence Island.
Here's a recording of bowhead whales. Next, we're going to hear some walrus calls.
What's really cool about the walrus is that they're, they make these amazing knocks. And, it's just like, if when you hear those sounds, first of all, if it just doesn't put a smile on your face, it's pretty amazing. It actually sounds like someone's knocking on the door. Just pretty cool. And again, walrus, off of Savunga, again, very interesting patterns that we witnessed. Again, in essence, the typical patterns associated with sea ice that very consistently correlated with the time of year and the sea ice presence. Really large numbers of walrus present, from December through to April. Really just consistent and sustained seasonality in that period, in that part of St. Lawrence Island. And that's again, from the traditional ecological knowledge to the censuses that we understand, this is a large portion, an amazing portion of the Pacific walrus population. So it's pretty amazing work, and it's great to get those detections where you start seeing some of the the traditional ecological knowledge, other types of census data, and other bits of tagging data, all supported by the year-round monitoring that we did.
Here's a walrus call. All right, and our final call will be the bearded seal.
Yeah, so the bearded seals, that's one of our, the bearded seals has some both personal and professional linkages that, I'll delve into that one a little bit. First of all, I mean, those sounds that the bearded seal makes, having seen those animals, like many of the others, up and close and personal in the Arctic, I love that like basically trill that they make. It's just a phenomenal sound. And when you see these seals, you're just thinking just like similar to the walrus, like how does that animal produce that sound? It's a really amazing and striking. On the professional side, what's really amazing in the history of it is that G. Carlton Ray, who was a New York Aquarium curator, which is part of the Wildlife Conservation Society, 50 years ago, to the date, literally, of the publication of our study in marine mammal science, first described the calls of bearded seals in 1969. So it's really phenomenal that 50 years later, here we are from the Wildlife Conservation Society, picking up on the amazing, groundbreaking work done by, G. Carlton Ray, going out on the ice and recording the sounds of these animals. And here we are putting these passive acoustic recorders, into the ocean, recovering them, and then picking up, literally, wide scale calls covering larger geographic areas in the Bering Strait, building on the legacy and the tradition of that work started by WCS 50 years ago, and now we're continuing it with it as part of our Ocean Giants program and the Arctic Beringia regional program, along with our partners.
Okay, here is the trill of a bearded seal. Aside from just providing a baseline of data against which the effects of global climate change on the Arctic can be measured, Rosenbaum says the study's findings have a number of other implications for conservation strategies in the region.
Yeah, there's so many important facets to the work that in essence, it's the first study to conduct year-round monitoring off of St. Lawrence Island, and it does provide that important, repeatable, relatively fine scale, but in the big picture of the Bering Strait, on the time and space patterns for marine mammals. But and again, it sets that framework, for there. But as we look at this in the context of the rapidly transforming Arctic ecosystem, that's witnessing and experiences increased anthropogenic pressures like shipping and noise and all these different issues. Those data exist now, and so the authorities that are charged with managing and protecting marine mammals in these areas, whether it's from navigable issues and around maritime traffic and or noise, have to recognize these data. So that has to be considered in any types of mitigation or efforts to minimize potential impacts from those anthropogenic activities. It does also help, look at, any interannual variability. It does set that baseline and anything that could be caused by long-term changes, both in environmental conditions like climate change or anthropogenic activities. And something else that I think is really important from what this work did, and I think, what I hope that your listeners and, will get out of this is that, these are some of the most amazing species in the world, right? These are massive numbers of animals congregating in the Bering Strait to use this area. It's a phenomenal wildlife spectacle that most people will never get to see or, in essence, get a glimpse of. And by, shedding some light on that through the Arctic soundscape that we've helped portray and that your listeners will get to hear a little bit of, you'll begin to put those signature calls to what everyone identifies and knows via seeing them on TV or on the internet or in an aquarium, walrus, seals, beluga whales. And people begin to understand, how we study them, what it's like to work on these animals, how we detect them, how they use this important habitat. So it will place some of what, these people see and never get to experience in the wild in some broader context. It will make it more real for people that may never even get a chance to experience these iconic Arctic marine mammals.
If you enjoy the Manga Bay Newscast, we ask that you please consider becoming a monthly sponsor via our Patreon page at patreon.com/mangabay. Just $1 per month will really help us offset production costs and hosting fees. So if you're a fan of our audio reports from Nature's Frontline, please support the Manga Bay Newscast at patreon.com/mangabay. That's patreon.com/mangabay. And don't forget you can subscribe to the Manga Bay Newscast on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, CastBox, or wherever you get your podcasts from. And of course, you can read all of our news and inspiration from Nature's Frontline at mangabay.com. If you prefer to keep up with us on social media, follow us at facebook.com/mangabay or on Twitter and Instagram. Our handle is @mangabay on both of those platforms. Thanks as always for listening to the Manga Bay Newscast. I'm your host Mike Gorecki signing off. Talk to you again in 2 weeks.